Welcome, dear listener. You have arrived once again at Sleepy Historian, your quiet corner of the internet where boring history becomes the gentle rhythm of bedtime storytelling. This is the place where we wander into the soft shadows of the past, not to be thrilled or shaken, but to be lulled into stillness. Boring history for sleep, falling asleep to boring history, bedtime relaxation, and soft storytelling, calm bedtime narration. All of these belong here. If the past has ever felt like a safe, slow-moving tide carrying you into slumber, then you are in the right place. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you wish, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting into sleep to the same old stories. Perhaps someone in London is listening at midnight, while another in Tokyo drifts off at dawn. Perhaps you're curled up in a quiet room, the lights dim, the sound of history flowing softly in the background. Together, we create a small and gentle community of listeners, fans of Roman history, archaeology, and calm narration, lovers of history sleep stories, seekers of relaxing history to fall asleep to. So now settle in. Take a breath as you loosen your shoulders and let the modern world recede, just a little. Imagine the steady glow of a candle flickering on parchment, the scratch of a quill writing names long forgotten, and the quiet echo of footsteps in the stone hallways of another time. We are about to step into the rituals of the medieval world, where love, duty, family, and community were bound together in ceremonies that may seem strange, even quaint, to us today. Our theme for tonight is the strange rituals of medieval weddings you've never heard of. Weddings in the Middle Ages were not always about romance. They were about alliances, property, and family honor, wrapped in layers of ritual and tradition. Some customs may feel curious, others a little unsettling, and a few may even make you smile at their strangeness. But all of them speak to the rhythm of medieval life, where nothing was purely private, and even the most intimate union was a matter of spectacle and community. In this journey, we will move gently through 4 different kinds of stories. First, we'll immerse ourselves in daily life, imagining what it was like for ordinary people preparing for and experiencing a wedding in the medieval village. Next, we'll explore a particular biography or event that shaped wedding traditions in surprising ways. Then, we'll wander into the realm of mystery, archaeology, and culture, examining curious artifacts and strange practices surrounding marriage. Finally, we will contrast the lives of peasants with those of the nobility, seeing how social rank transformed the wedding experience. Each part will flow slowly and steadily, like a river carrying you through time. My voice will guide you, but gently, so you may listen or drift into dreams whenever sleep calls. The stories are here whether you are fully awake or half asleep. Nothing urgent waits within them, only history at its softest. So let the lights dim. Let the hush of the present fall around you. And let us begin our exploration of the strange rituals of medieval weddings you've never heard of. Imagine yourself walking along the narrow lanes of a medieval village, the ground uneven beneath your feet, scattered with straw and the faint imprint of wagon wheels. The air carries a mixture of scents, the faint sweetness of wood smoke drifting from cottage hearths, the earthiness of damp soil, and the sharp tang of freshly tanned leather from the workshop nearby. In this world, the rhythms of daily life were slow, steady, and shaped by the turning of the seasons. But today is different. There's a quiet hum of expectation, for a wedding is about to take place. For the ordinary people of the Middle Ages, weddings were not only private affairs, but public events that drew in the whole community. Marriage was not just the binding of 2 individuals. It was the weaving together of families, fields, fortunes, and obligations. You can picture the bride, perhaps no older than her mid-teens, preparing in a simple cottage. Her dress is not the elaborate gown we often imagine, but rather her best tunic, freshly washed and smelling faintly of lye soap, its colors muted but brightened by the day's occasion. Over her hair, she wears a plain veil, pinned carefully to frame her face. Around her, Women of the household bustled quietly. They plait her hair, weaving in ribbons if the family can afford them. In some places, rosemary sprigs or other herbs might be tucked into her braids, carrying both fragrance and symbolic meaning. Rosemary was thought to represent fidelity, sage to signify wisdom, and rue for protection. These details were more than decorative. They were small charms meant to guide the couple's fortune in a world where superstition and faith were deeply intertwined. Outside, neighbors gathered slowly, curious but also obligated to witness the vows. A wedding was not considered valid unless it was publicly declared, for secrecy bred suspicion. The couple might exchange vows on the church steps, in view of the village, rather than inside the church itself. This detail often surprises modern listeners, but it reflects the communal nature of marriage. Only after vows were exchanged might the priest lead the couple inside for a blessing at the altar. The atmosphere of the village wedding is not one of grandeur, but of familiarity. You can imagine the children running between the legs of the crowd, catching glimpses of the bride's nervous smile. Farmers pause their work, leaning on wooden tools as they watch. Even the animals seem part of the scene. The clucking of hens, the low sound of cattle shifting nearby. It is a wedding as much for the community as for the couple. Yet beneath this simple scene lies a web of meaning. Marriage was a contract, a binding agreement recognized both by the church and by custom. Dowries and property arrangements were carefully discussed long before the wedding day. For poorer families, the exchange might be modest: a few chickens, a patch of land, or a set of tools. For wealthier villagers, perhaps a cow, or even a small share of a field. Whatever the scale, these agreements mattered deeply. They shaped the future of families and ensured that each side had something to gain from the union. The vows themselves were direct and binding. Unlike the poetic phrases we might think of today, medieval vows were plain, spoken in the common tongue. Promises to be faithful, to share life's burdens, and to remain together for better, for worse. The church emphasized permanence, but daily life emphasized practicality. If two families agreed, the union carried weight not only before God, but before the eyes of every villager present. After the vows came blessings. The priest might sprinkle holy water, a symbol of purity and protection. The couple's hands were often bound together with a length of cloth or ribbon, a practice known as hand fasting. This gesture, simple yet profound, symbolized their unity, and its imagery still survives in some modern wedding rituals. Imagine the soft cloth resting on their joined hands, the murmured Latin prayers floating through the still air, the solemn faces of those watching. Once the blessing concluded, the mood shifted. What had begun with gravity gave way to festivity. The village, weary from labor, welcomed any reason to feast. The bride and groom might be led to a communal meal where bread, cheese, and ale were shared generously. If the harvest had been good, perhaps roasted meats appeared on the tables. If times were lean, the food was simpler, but the laughter and music carried weight enough. Fiddles, pipes, and drums might be brought out, filling the air with uneven but joyful sound. Dances began, rough circles of villagers moving with energy more than grace. The bride, shy but smiling, would be pulled into the dance, her veil shifting as she turned. Neighbors toasted the couple, raising cups of ale, the liquid frothing at the rim. There was no expectation of luxury. The gift was in the sharing, in the acknowledgement that life was easier when bound together in community. As the night deepened, the customs sometimes took stranger turns. In some villages, the couple was escorted to their bedchamber in a ritual that balanced humor and seriousness. This bedding ceremony was not as scandalous as it may sound today, but it was a symbolic transition, watched over by trusted family members. Candles flickered against plaster walls. Hushed voices muttered blessings, and the sense was not of voyeurism, but of continuity, ensuring that the union began properly under both human and divine witness. Thus, the wedding day in a medieval village was a tapestry of simple actions, symbolic gestures, and communal bonds. Not one thread alone defined it. Rather, it was the weaving together of promises, property, faith, and festivity. In those centuries have passed, one can still feel the weight of those rituals echoing faintly, like footsteps on old stone, lingering in memory. As the morning of a medieval wedding stretched into the heart of the day, the rhythm of village life shifted entirely. Ordinarily, such hours were filled with the sounds of wooden plows groaning through soil, the steady strike of hammers in the smithy, or the bleating of sheep herded toward pasture. But on a wedding day, the ordinary was suspended. Fields were left and tilled. Ovens worked overtime to prepare loaves, and every household contributed what they could to mark the occasion. You can imagine the bride rising early, before dawn, the room dim and smoky from the hearth. A basin of water, cool and faintly metallic in scent, was brought to her for washing. Soap made from animal fat and ash, coarse against the skin, was used sparingly. She would put on her best clothing, not a gown spun for the event, but rather the finest she already owned. For most village brides, there was no such thing as a wedding dress distinct from daily garments. The difference lay in cleanliness, careful preparation, and perhaps the addition of a belt or ribbon in bright color, something rare enough to feel festive. A curious custom lingered in some regions. The bride was accompanied by a bride ale. This was not simply a drink, but a gathering where ale was brewed specially for the marriage. Sometimes the bride herself was said to have brewed it, or her family did so on her behalf. Guests purchased the ale, and the proceeds supported the couple's new household. It was both a celebration and a fundraiser, practical and festive in equal measure. Imagine long wooden tubs of frothing liquid, the scent of malt filling the air, neighbors exchanging coins and tankards, the laughter of young men carrying jugs across the square. The ale was thick, nourishing, and often consumed in great quantities, blurring the line between merriment and solemnity. Meanwhile, the groom had his own rituals to observe. He might be dressed by his friends or family members, his garments likewise plain but carefully tended. In some places, the groom would present himself with a token gift for his bride, a belt, a small piece of silver, or even a shared loaf of bread. These gestures were small but symbolic, anchoring the union in generosity. The path to the church was as much a part of the ritual as the ceremony itself. The couple, often flanked by family and accompanied by neighbors, would walk slowly toward the parish church. The bells rang out, their sound heavy and resonant, carrying across the fields. Imagine the solemn toll of the bell mixing with the chatter of villagers, the clatter of wooden shoes on the packed earth, and the sight of the bride's veil catching the breeze. For a brief moment, the entire community's focus gathered on this procession, as if the path itself was a sacred thread linking the village to eternity. Upon arrival, there were blessings before the threshold. This mattered because the act of marriage was not only personal, but legal and spiritual. Witnesses confirmed the couple's consent, and their words were binding. The Latin prayers spoken by the priest might have been incomprehensible to many, but their rhythm, their weight, was enough to remind all present that the union carried the sanction of heaven. Yet even amid such gravity, humor and playfulness crept in. Children were known to toss small grains of wheat or barley over the couple, a gesture of fertility and prosperity. In some areas, mischievous friends might attempt playful tricks, hiding the groom's shoes, tying a rope across the path, or singing teasing songs. These moments reveal the communal joy that existed alongside the solemn vows. When the ceremony was complete, there remained another curious practice: the public acknowledgement of the bride's transfer from one household to another. In some traditions, the bride's father would physically hand her over, a gesture both literal and symbolic. For families of modest means, this could carry economic weight, as the daughter moved her labor, her dowry, and her fertility to another household. Though it may sound stark to modern ears, in medieval minds this act was practical, almost contractual, yet still wrapped in ritual language and gestures of blessing. Once the wedding concluded at the church, the celebration unfolded with increasing warmth. The tables in the village might be set outdoors if the weather allowed. the rough boards laden with whatever could be spared. Stews simmered with vegetables and small cuts of meat, bread loaves cracked open to reveal soft crumb, and pitchers of ale passed from hand to hand. The soundscape of the feast was unmistakable. The scrape of wooden spoons and bowls, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Music soon followed, and with it the dances. Medieval dances were often communal, circular, and repetitive, designed to draw in many participants rather than showcase individuals. You might imagine villagers holding hands in long chains, stepping in rhythm, their movements simple but infectious. The bride, pulled gently into the circle, would move with hesitance at first, then with growing ease. The groom, urged by friends, would eventually join as well. Together, their steps symbolized entry into the shared life of the community. The transition from day to evening brought yet another layer of ritual. The couple's bed was prepared, sometimes with herbs scattered on the sheets, lavender for peace, fennel for protection, and sometimes even garlic, believed to ward off evil spirits. A procession, both celebratory and teasing, might escort the couple to their chamber. Songs were sung, jokes exchanged, and blessings muttered. The bedding ceremony was not intrusive in detail, but symbolic, a recognition that the union was complete and that the community itself had borne witness to its beginning. And so, in the simple framework of a medieval village wedding, you see layers of meaning: practical arrangements, communal bonds, blessings of the church, playful traditions, and the ever-present hum of superstition. It was not merely a day for two individuals, but a day for everyone, a moment when the fabric of life was restitched and made secure for another generation. The mourning, the procession, and the vows have passed. Now, in the lingering glow of the feast, the medieval village wedding moves into its deeper rituals, those quiet and curious practices that gave shape to memory and tradition. Weddings in the Middle Ages were never only about two people. They were about weaving the couple into the fabric of communal life. And so, even as the day stretched onward, the ceremonies continued in subtler, slower rhythms. Imagine the bride and groom seated together for the first time as a public couple. They are side by side at the high table, though high, maybe no more than a wooden plank elevated slightly above the rest. Before them rest bread, meat, and jugs of ale. The bread is torn and shared, a symbolic meal that represents the beginning of a household. Some traditions included the breaking of a symbolic cake or wafer above their heads, the crumbs falling like blessings. In parts of Europe, spice cakes or honey bread might have been used instead, the sweetness meant to draw fortune into their shared life. As the meal unfolds, a curious custom called the chivalry occasionally intrudes. This was a noisy procession, sometimes playful, sometimes mocking, where villagers banged pots and pans, sang rough songs, and paraded noisily outside the couple's home or feast. To modern minds, it might seem disruptive, but in medieval villages, it was a form of communal acknowledgement, a reminder that the community itself held the right to approve or to disapprove of unions. Sometimes, if a marriage was considered improper, the chivalry was deliberately cruel. But at other times, it was more of a noisy celebration, full of humor, laughter, and the clamor of voices. Imagine the pounding rhythm of wooden spoons on iron pots, the uneven clashing sound filling the night, and the flicker of torches carried in the dark. Another ritual, gentler in tone, involved the giving of small tokens. Guests sometimes brought simple gifts: a jug, a woolen blanket, a loaf of bread, or even coins. The exchange of gifts was not about wealth, but about ensuring the couple could begin their new household with stability. For the poorer villagers, even a loaf or a piece of cloth was a meaningful contribution. These small exchanges remind us that survival in medieval life was always communal. Nobody could thrive entirely alone. The bedding rituals continued as evening deepened. In some regions, the bride and groom were led to their chamber by torchlight, a moment that was both serious and playful. The community was present, but not intrusive. Candles cast long shadows on whitewashed walls, and the couple's bed, perhaps no more than straw covered with linens, was sprinkled with herbs. Rosemary, thyme, and lavender carried both fragrance and symbolism, meant to drive away ill fortune and encourage fertility. Sometimes, symbolic gestures accompanied the bedding. Shoes might be placed at the doorway, one belonging to the bride, one to the groom, to signify unity. In other places, the couple drank a spiced wine together from the same cup, a shared vessel symbolizing one life, one household. You can imagine the taste of warm, sweetened wine with cinnamon or nutmeg, flavors rare and treasured, filling the senses as the murmurs of well-wishers echoed in the background. Superstitions lingered throughout the night. Some believed that certain omens could foretell the future of the marriage. If the candle flame in the bedchamber flickered steadily, it was a sign of constancy. If it sputtered or went out, villagers whispered that the union might face trials. Even the weather outside was red for meaning. A steady rain might signify fertility, a clear night, prosperity. The medieval mind saw the world as interwoven, where natural signs and human events mirrored one another. The morning after carried its own rituals. In some places, the community expected proof that the marriage had been consummated, though in most villages this was symbolic rather than literal. The couple might be greeted with songs or presented with bread and salt as a symbol of a lasting household. Sometimes, the newlyweds were given a communal task, drawing water together, for instance, to show their unity in the practical labors of life. In the days that followed, the marriage continued to ripple outward. The couple visited neighbors, exchanged thanks for gifts, and formally joined in the web of obligations and alliances. A wedding was not a moment sealed in time. It was a beginning, marked with gestures that resonated for years to come. The dowry agreements were honored, the shared ale remembered, the bedding herbs dried and kept as tokens. Every layer of ritual reinforced the sense that life was cyclical, that new households replaced old ones, and that the community renewed itself with each union. And through it all, one senses a remarkable balance between joy and solemnity. The medieval wedding was not frivolous, nor was it purely sacred. It was a blending of both, where laughter mingled with prayers, where noisy chivalry parades balanced the solemn toll of church bells, and where the sharing of ale stood alongside the Latin blessing of the priest. This interplay of opposites was the rhythm of medieval life itself. Half sacred, half practical, never fully one or the other. As you reflect on this picture of a medieval wedding, let the details linger gently in your mind. The clatter of pots in the chivalry, the warmth of ale on the tongue, the flickering candle flame by the bed, and the hushed voices of neighbors offering blessings. Together, these fragments form the texture of daily life, woven into a pattern that is strangely familiar and yet deeply distant. In imagining them, you may find yourself drifting, as if the quiet hum of those rituals becomes a lullaby, soft and unhurried. If the village wedding revealed the texture of daily life, then the story of a single historical figure can reveal how marriage shaped not only households but kingdoms. For our next chapter, let us turn our gaze from the small thatched cottages of ordinary people to the stone halls of princes and queens. Here, weddings carried even greater weight, for they could forge alliances, end wars, or ignite them. And among the many tales of medieval matrimony, one of the most curious belongs to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was born in the early 12th century, heiress to the vast duchy of Aquitaine in what is now southwestern France. Imagine her childhood world, richly adorned halls, tapestries on stone walls, the sound of troubadour songs echoing through courtyards. Unlike the village bride, Eleanor's marriage would not be a personal choice, but a political necessity. As one of the most sought-after heiresses in Europe, her hand represented not just affection, but immense territory and power. At the age of 15, she was married to Louis, soon to become King Louis VII of France. The ceremony was elaborate, unfolding in Bordeaux Cathedral. Imagine the difference between this grand space and the modest parish churches of the peasants. Vaulted ceilings rising like stone forests overhead shafts of light piercing stained glass windows, the heavy incense filling the air. The solemn Latin chants of the clergy echoed across the congregation as the young couple stood before the altar, their hands joined not only in faith but in the binding of two realms. Yet, beneath the grandeur lay strangeness, for Eleanor's first marriage was marked not by harmony, but by discord. Louis, pious and austere, clashed with Eleanor's spirited and worldly nature. Their union, intended to strengthen the French crown, instead revealed the limits of marital alliance. They traveled together on the Second Crusade, a journey that began as a gesture of devotion but became a theater of tension. The strains of travel, the hardships of campaigning, and Eleanor's refusal to be a silent consort all frayed the bond. Whispers spread that she had overstepped the role expected of a medieval queen. The dissolution of their marriage, rare and dramatic, came in 1152. Their union was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. That is, they were too closely related, though in truth it was political dissatisfaction that drove the decision. Imagine the echoes of the annulment. Not only the parting of two individuals, but the unraveling of an alliance that had bound Aquitaine to the French crown. What followed was even more remarkable. Only 2 months later, Eleanor married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who would soon become Henry II of England. This second marriage shifted the balance of European power dramatically. With a single vow, Eleanor carried Aquitaine out of French hands and into the burgeoning Angevin Empire. This was not a simple wedding of affection. It was a political earthquake, accomplished with ritual, but carrying the weight of armies. The wedding to Henry was simpler in form, but grand in consequence. It took place in Poitiers Cathedral. Again, you can imagine the scene. The echo of chants, the glitter of ceremonial garments, the blessing of priests. Yet beneath the sacred rites lay shrewd calculation. Henry gained vast lands. Eleanor gained a husband far more aligned with her ambition. The two would go on to rule an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Even here, in the lofty world of kings and queens, the rituals bore resemblance to those of villagers. There were blessings, vows, and feasts. Bread was broken, wine was shared, music played. The difference lay not in the gestures themselves, but in their scale and meaning. For peasants, marriage secured a household. For Eleanor, marriage secured an empire. Her story reminds us that weddings in the medieval world were never merely personal. Whether in village squares or royal cathedrals, they were public, communal, and profoundly consequential. The strange rituals surrounding them, from the binding of hands with ribbons to the exchange of gifts, were threads in a larger fabric of life, binding individuals to families, families to kingdoms, and kingdoms to the tides of history. As you picture Eleanor in her flowing gown, standing beneath vaulted arches, let the contrast unfold softly in your imagination. The solemnity of kings weighed against the simplicity of peasants, both bound by the same vows, both shaped by the same need to anchor life in ritual. The candlelight may flicker on gold chalices or on wooden cups, but the flame itself remains the same. The story of Eleanor of Aquitaine is striking, but she was not alone in shaping the course of history through marriage. In the medieval world, the biographies of rulers are often intertwined with weddings, for each union was both a personal event and a political contract. To better understand the peculiarities of medieval marriage rituals, let us move northward to the lands of Scandinavia and the story of Margaret of Denmark, known to history as the Semiramis of the North. Margaret was born in 1353, daughter of King Valdemar IV of Denmark. From a moment of her birth, her life was destined to be bound up in politics. At the age of 10, she was married to Håkon, King of Norway, in a ceremony designed to secure alliances between kingdoms often at odds. Imagine this young girl, dressed in finery beyond her years, entering the halls of Oslo Cathedral. Around her, the great men of two realms stood solemnly, each aware that the vows of a child would shape the future of Scandinavia. The language of the prayers would have been Latin, steady and incomprehensible to her young mind. yet binding her to a husband she hardly knew. Such early marriages were not unusual among royalty. They were contracts before they were relationships. And yet, despite the strangeness of the arrangement, Margaret grew into her role with remarkable skill. When Haakon died, Margaret ruled as regent for their son. Later, through a series of careful maneuvers, she united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her crown, becoming one of the most powerful rulers of her age. The seeds of this vast political achievement lay in that early wedding ceremony, an event both fragile and monumental. The rituals of her marriage, though similar in form to others across Europe, carried peculiar Scandinavian touches. Chronicles tell us that feasting in Norway was especially grand, with mead flowing freely, horns lifted high, and songs sung well into the night. Mead, made from fermented honey, was more than drink. It was a symbol of unity and prosperity. The honeymoon itself traces its roots to these traditions, when a bride and groom were encouraged to drink mead for a full cycle of the moon after their wedding to ensure fertility and happiness. Picture the golden liquid, thick and sweet, catching the light of torches as guests toasted the young queen, her cheeks flushed with both the drink and the weight of expectation. There were also symbolic acts performed at her wedding feast. Some accounts speak of the bride being ceremonially carried across the threshold into her new household, a gesture not unlike customs still remembered today. In medieval Scandinavia, the act was layered with meaning, a sign of transition, protection against evil spirits, and assurance that the bride entered her new home under auspicious conditions. Imagine the laughter of courtiers as the young bride was lifted, her silk dress billowing, the doorway adorned with evergreen boughs to ward away misfortune. The public nature of such weddings cannot be overstated. While peasants and townsfolk might only hear distant bells or rumors, the nobility watched every gesture carefully. Who stood nearest to the bride? Which families were given precedence at the feast? Which gifts were exchanged? All of these details were laden with symbolism. Even the seating arrangements spoke volumes, with allies placed in honored positions and rivals given more distant seats. A wedding was a chessboard, every piece placed deliberately. Margaret's marriage, solemnized in ritual and festivity, would have seemed ordinary enough at the time, one more dynastic union among many. Yet, like Eleanor's, it carried long shadows. Her ability to transform a childhood bond into the foundation of the Kalmar Union reminds us that medieval weddings were not isolated moments. They were seeds planted in the soil of politics, watered by ritual, and brought to fruit by ambition. From the richly carved cathedrals of France to the mead-filled halls of Norway, we see the same pattern repeated. Vows exchanged under clerical blessing, hands joined, feasts shared, and tokens offered. Yet each place added its own peculiarities, its own small rituals that gave the marriage its flavor. Whether it was the mead horn lifted in Oslo, the honey cakes broken in Poitiers, or the simple bread shared on a village green, all carried the same underlying message. Marriage was sacred, communal, and binding. If you listen carefully to these stories, you may notice a rhythm: the binding of hands, the drinking of shared cups, the crossing of thresholds. They recur across geography and time, variations on a theme, repeated until they feel almost like an incantation. Imagine them now, repeated again and again. Hands joined, bread broken, cups shared. The rhythm itself becomes soothing, like the toll of a bell in the distance, steady, unchanging, carrying across the centuries. Margaret's story, like Eleanor's, illustrates how a single wedding ceremony could ripple outward into history. And yet, behind the politics and power, we glimpse the human reality. A young bride, nervous and uncertain, entering a life she could not yet imagine, wrapped in rituals she did not fully understand. That mixture of vulnerability and ceremony, of humanity and symbolism, is at the very heart of medieval marriage. As we continue exploring the biographies tied to marriage, let us turn to one of the more unusual unions of the medieval world, the wedding of Joanna of Castile, remembered in history as Joanna the Mad. and her husband Philip the Handsome. Their story, though tragic in its ending, began with rituals and celebrations that reflected the grandeur of late medieval Spain and the opulence of the Burgundian court. Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, grew up in a Spain charged with religious intensity and political ambition. Her marriage to Philip was arranged to strengthen ties with the Habsburg dynasty, extending the reach of her parents' influence across Europe. The ceremony took place in 1496 in the city of Lier in the Low Countries. Imagine the cobbled streets alive with color, banners bearing the heraldry of Castile, Leon, and Burgundy fluttering against the autumn sky, bells ringing in the towers, and townsfolk craning to catch a glimpse of their new rulers. The ritual itself followed the liturgy of the church, yet it bore marks of local custom. The chroniclers tell us that the bride and groom were robed in silks heavy with embroidery, pearls stitched into the very seams, so that each step shimmered with quiet magnificence. The bishop presiding intoned the prayers in Latin, his voice echoing off stone walls as incense hung in the air, a fragrant veil uniting earth and heaven. At the pivotal moment, their right hands were joined. A golden ring slipped onto Joanna's finger, sealing a bond that would shape dynastic struggle for generations. Yet behind this solemnity, there were subtler rituals. In Burgundy, a tradition endured of offering the bride a symbolic gift of bread and wine, a gesture that reached far back into the memory of Christian sacrament and household provision. Imagine Joanna, regal yet nervous, breaking the bread delicately, sipping from a cup offered by her attendants. This quiet act was a reminder that, beyond crowns and treaties, marriage was also about shared sustenance and trust. The wedding feast stretched long into the night, a tapestry of sights and sounds. Musicians played on shawms and lutes, their melodies weaving through the air. Tables bent beneath the weight of roasted meats, spiced pies, sugared almonds, and golden loaves. But perhaps most striking were the pageants, elaborate entertainments staged between courses, where allegorical figures performed moral tales. In one account, performers dressed as Roman gods entered, offering tokens of fertility and prosperity, their gestures stylized and solemn, half theater, half ritual. Such spectacles were common in Burgundian tradition, where the blending of feast and theater transformed weddings into miniature worlds of symbolism. For Joanna, this marriage was both a triumph and the beginning of sorrow. Her love for Philip was profound, yet it deepened into obsession, and when he died young, her grief clouded the rest of her life. Still, the rituals of her wedding remind us of how medieval ceremonies carried within them both grandeur and fragility. The binding of hands, the exchange of rings, the sharing of bread. These elements repeat across centuries, becoming familiar rhythms. And yet, each setting adds its own texture. In Spain, there was the echo of reconquest and royal ambition. In Burgundy, the theatrical pageants brought spectacle to the table. In northern towns, the streets filled with guildsmen bearing torches. In each place, the wedding was not simply a union of two people, but a mirror of an entire society, reflecting its values, its hopes, and its anxieties. Let us pause and imagine that banquet hall once more. Long tables lit by candlelight, shadows flickering on painted walls, guests leaning close, voices lowered as plates were passed and goblets refilled. Outside, the town hummed with celebration, vendors selling roasted chestnuts, children darting between stalls, and distant bells tolling the hour. The atmosphere was festive, yet the weight of history pressed down. Everyone in attendance knew that this marriage tied kingdoms together, and that the rituals they witnessed would ripple outward, shaping alliances and wars yet to come. These stories, though centuries old, are not so distant. Even now, many of the customs we see at modern weddings, rings, feasts, music, the lifting of glasses and toast, trace their lineage back to these medieval halls. The words may have changed, the costumes altered, but the essence remains. Marriage is ritual as much as relationship, and in every age, it binds the present to the future. As we reflect on Joanna's ceremony and those of Eleanor and Margaret before her, we can see the continuity, the hand joined, the bread broken, the threshold crossed. These rituals, repeated across time, are as steady and soothing as the tolling of a bell. You might hear them now, softly, a rhythm carrying across centuries, gentle and unbroken. The personal stories of queens and brides give us glimpses into grand ceremonies. Yet there is another way to approach the subject of medieval weddings, through the quiet work of archaeology and the fragments of material culture left behind. For while chronicles tell us what kings and bishops wished remembered, objects buried in the earth and discovered centuries later whisper more intimate tales of how marriages were lived and celebrated. One of the most striking mysteries involves the curious tokens exchanged during medieval betrothals and weddings. Excavations across Europe have unearthed small rings, charms, and carved pieces of bone, often inscribed with symbols of fidelity or protection. Many of these items never appeared in written accounts, yet they were clearly treasured. Imagine a field in rural England, a spade turning up a bronze ring with clasped hands engraved upon it, two fingers intertwined forever in metal. Such a find speaks to the long-forgotten vows of a couple whose names are lost to history, yet whose bond survives in a fragment. Archaeologists have also discovered traces of wedding feasts. At sites near medieval manors, layers of soil revealed discarded bones of cattle, swine, and fowl, sometimes mixed with charred grains and fragments of pottery. These remnants suggest banquets larger than the everyday meals of peasants. When clusters of drinking vessels are found together, one imagines the clinking of cups in celebration, the ritual of toasting repeated until the echoes filled the night. Even without words, the evidence suggests festivity, ritual, and the collective memory of a union marked in food and drink. Perhaps the most mysterious are the objects connected with protective rituals. In some burials and foundations, archaeologists have uncovered small amulets, tiny bells, knotted cords, or scraps of parchment, placed where newlyweds might have lived. Scholars speculate these were charms intended to safeguard the marriage from ill fortune. In one case, a tiny lead tablet inscribed with a short Latin prayer was found sealed in the threshold of a cottage in France. Imagine the scene: a craftsman carefully placing it beneath the doorway before a bride entered her new home, hoping the words would ward away mischief and misfortune. Other mysteries lie in folk customs described only vaguely in chronicles, but hinted at in art and excavation. There are reports of brides being sprinkled with grains, a gesture of fertility, and indeed, archaeologists have sometimes found scattered wheat or barley in the remains of medieval churchyards, grains preserved in the soil for centuries. These details seem small, yet when pieced together, they offer a more complete picture of weddings not as grand spectacles, but as deeply human events, filled with quiet rituals meant to bring prosperity and safety. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes depict weddings with curious imagery. In the margins of certain 14th century texts, one can see small drawings of brides and grooms led by figures of animals, hares or dogs, meant as symbols of loyalty or fruitfulness. While playful, such images reflect the blending of solemn ritual and light-hearted charm. They remind us that medieval people, like us, balanced reverence with humor, even in sacred moments. Archaeology also reveals the social layers of weddings. In wealthy households, fragments of delicate glass goblets have been unearthed, imported from Venice, their colors still faintly glowing. By contrast, in rural villages, archaeologists find coarse pottery jugs, sturdy and unadorned, yet clearly used in gatherings where ale was poured for all. Both speak of weddings, one adorned with luxury, the other marked by simple abundance. In each, the same impulse is present: to share, to feast, to seal a union with community. The mystery lies not only in what has been found, but in what remains absent. Despite countless excavations, very few direct traces of wedding garments survive. Textiles decay quickly, and what remains are tiny fragments of embroidered silk or traces of dye and soil. And yet, Even these whispers tell us that brides wore fabrics richer than their everyday clothes, threads colored with madder red or woad blue, hues that once glowed in torchlight. Taken together, these archaeological glimpses remind us that medieval weddings were both grand and humble. They were public contracts and private hopes. They left traces in rings, cups, grains, and charms. And though the voices of those who celebrated are long gone, the objects they touched still carry their presence. Imagine yourself standing in a quiet museum gallery, gazing at a small bronze ring behind glass. The room is silent, yet in your mind you can almost hear the faint sound of bells, the laughter of guests, the words of vows spoken long ago. In this way, archaeology transforms forgotten soil into living memory, giving us entry into rituals half-hidden, half-remembered. They may never be fully explained, yet in their mystery lies their power. And as with so many aspects of the past, the uncertainty itself has a calming rhythm, like waves against a shore, steady, continuous, unresolved. When we think of medieval weddings, we often imagine cathedrals and noble halls, yet much of what we know of their mysteries comes not from the grandest events, but from fragments preserved in folklore, local records, and chance discoveries. These scattered details are like pieces of a puzzle, some bright, some faded, each hinting at practices that were once meaningful but are now half forgotten. One curious example comes from Germany, where records speak of the Brautegamkrans, or groom's wreath. While we are accustomed to brides wearing floral crowns, in certain regions, grooms too were crowned with greenery, often oak leaves or vines, symbolizing strength and fertility. Archaeologists have occasionally found dried plant matter interwoven with ribbon in grave contexts, suggesting that wedding garlands were sometimes preserved long after the ceremony, buried with their owners as tokens of identity and memory. Picture a young groom in a village church, oak wreath resting gently upon his brow, the scent of leaves mingling with candle smoke, his expression both solemn and uncertain as vows were spoken. Other regions preserved more enigmatic rituals. In the Low Countries, there is a custom known as the Bed of Art, a kind of pilgrimage undertaken by newlyweds to a local shrine. The purpose was not only to seek blessings, but also to demonstrate humility and obedience to the divine order. Traces of these pilgrimages are found in scallop shell badges, small pewter tokens sold at shrines, which occasionally appear in archaeological digs. Some are etched with symbols of clasped hands, others with doves. To hold one in your hand today is to sense the journey of a couple, walking together on dusty roads, hoping for divine favor on the path ahead. In Scandinavia, there are hints of more dramatic gestures. Folk tradition tells us that brides sometimes carried symbolic keys during their wedding ceremonies, representing their authority over the household they were about to govern. These keys were not mere trinkets. Archaeological finds in Norway and Sweden have unearthed ornate bronze keys, sometimes engraved, often larger than necessary for practical use. Scholars suggest they were ceremonial, passed to the bride as part of her transition. Imagine the weight of such a key, cool in the hand, heavy with responsibility, gleaming faintly as it was pressed into the palm of a young woman. The layering of ritual and meaning becomes clear when we turn to wedding songs. Though music itself leaves no trace in the soil, written records preserve lyrics that were sung as part of marriage festivities. Some are lighthearted, playful verses teasing the couple. Others invoke blessings, repeating phrases about prosperity, children, and long life. Manuscripts occasionally illustrate these scenes, small figures with musical instruments tucked into margins, suggesting that weddings were accompanied by both solemn hymns and rustic tunes. The mystery lies in how these were performed, how the air must have vibrated with melody and laughter, echoing in wooden halls or across village greens. We also find curious evidence in legal documents. In parts of France and England, contracts survive in which land was transferred at the time of marriage. Strikingly, some of these records include mentions of symbolic gestures, a clod of earth handed to the groom, or a knife exchanged between families. These gestures, though legal in purpose, carried ritual weight. They tied property to marriage, soil to union, possession to promise. To see them written in a notary's careful Latin is to glimpse the blending of law and custom, the practical bound up with the ceremonial. Perhaps the most mysterious of all are the fragments of forgotten superstitions. In some regions, brides were said to step over running water before entering their new homes to cleanse misfortune. Elsewhere, couples were led 3 times around a hearth before sitting down to their first meal together. Archaeology hints at these practices through charred deposits and hearths, where grains and herbs appear to have been cast deliberately. These small rituals, unrecorded in great chronicles, remind us that weddings were not only political or sacred. They were deeply rooted in the rhythms of ordinary households, where protection and blessing mattered as much as pomp and display. Imagine yourself in one of those homes, a timbered hall, smoke curling upward through the rafters, shadows dancing on plastered walls. The bride steps over the threshold, perhaps carrying a key, perhaps with grains scattered at her feet. A charm might lie hidden beneath the floorboards, a bell or ribbon or parchment tucked away, unseen but present. The air carries a mixture of scents: wax, wood smoke, the sweetness of ale. The voices of neighbors murmur blessings, the rhythm of their words steady and calm. These are mysteries we can only half reconstruct, yet in their incompleteness they feel strangely vivid, almost more real than what is clearly documented. Such rituals, though obscure, offer a soothing continuity. We know the grand outlines of medieval life: battles, treaties, kings, but it is these quiet customs, passed from hand to hand, that connect us most directly to the past. And though we may never solve their mysteries entirely, we can let them rest as they are: fragments, gentle echoes, like lullabies carried by time. The more we explore the cultural traces of medieval weddings, the more we see that they straddled the line between sacred ritual and everyday magic. Churches offered the blessing of priests and the authority of sacrament, yet beneath those layers lay older, quieter customs that endured across centuries. Rituals half Christian, half pagan, designed to guard, to bless, or simply to entertain. One curious tradition described in English and German sources involves the practice of bedding rituals. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom were ceremonially escorted to their bedchamber, not in secrecy, but as part of a public act of community recognition. In some towns, witnesses would gather at the chamber door, blessing the union with laughter, song, and sometimes playful teasing. Archaeological traces of this practice are elusive, yet a handful of surviving tapestries and manuscript illustrations hint at these scenes. Guests bearing torches, the bed draped in embroidered cloth, the couple seated solemnly while attendants hovered. Imagine the chamber, lit with soft glow, crowded voices drifting into a hush as the curtain was drawn, the ritual both solemn and oddly communal. Protective charms often played a role in this transition to married life. In parts of Eastern Europe, folklore speaks of brides carrying small knives or needles hidden in their gowns, not as weapons, but as protective talismans against envy or ill-wishing. In graves and household excavations, archaeologists have indeed uncovered tiny iron objects placed in thresholds or hearths, suggesting a belief that sharp iron repelled harmful forces. To envision a young bride stepping through her new doorway, a needle pinned discreetly to her hem, is to see how superstition and ritual blended seamlessly into daily life. Another fascinating layer appears in the use of color. Manuscript illuminations sometimes show brides clad not in white, but in rich reds, greens, or even gold. Fragments of textile dyes recovered from archaeological sites confirm these choices. Madder for red, woad for blue, weld for yellow, each plant carefully cultivated and prized. The symbolism of color varied: red for vitality, green for fertility, blue for loyalty. While white became the dominant color centuries later, medieval brides walked proudly in garments that glowed like the fields and flowers of their world. Imagine a procession moving through a village street, the bride's gown of deep red catching the sun, embroidered hems swaying with each step, the crowd murmuring admiration. Feasting customs, too, contain mysteries. In some places, newlyweds shared a charity loaf, a special bread baked not for the wedding party, but for the poor of the parish. Archaeological layers sometimes yield fragments of bread molds stamped with crosses or symbols of clasped hands. These suggest a ritual act of sharing beyond the immediate family, an acknowledgement that marriage was not a private event, but one that touched the entire community. One can picture villagers receiving slices of blessed bread, eaten slowly, as if each crumb carried with it the hope of prosperity. Even the spaces where weddings took place carry archaeological mysteries. In some rural parishes, foundations of chapels have been excavated showing curious arrangements of thresholds, double doorways, side porches, or steps arranged for processions. Scholars speculate that these architectural features facilitated wedding rites. One door for entry, another for departure, symbolizing transition from one life to another. Standing in the ruins today, with moss growing between stones and silence replacing chant, it is still possible to sense the ritual pathways once trodden by brides and grooms. And then there are the more playful customs. In parts of France, records mention the chivalry, a noisy ritual where villagers would gather outside the couple's home, banging pots and pans, singing raucous songs, sometimes even staging mock parades. While it may sound disruptive, the purpose was paradoxical: to mark the marriage with public recognition, to fold it into the rhythm of community life. Archaeological hints of this exist in broken pottery, found clustered near village thresholds, perhaps remnants of ritual noise-making. Imagine the din of clashing metal, the laughter of neighbors, the bride half smiling, half blushing as her new life began under such clamor. What unites these mysteries is their dual nature. They were practical and symbolic, ordinary and extraordinary. They left faint traces, iron pins, colored threads, bread molds, architectural quirks that now require patient interpretation. Yet behind each lies the same theme. Weddings were never only about two individuals. They were woven into the fabric of community, infused with beliefs that balanced the sacred and the everyday. Let us pause once more and imagine a quiet room, a museum gallery where these fragments rest, a corroded iron needle, a scrap of red-dyed fabric, a clay mold stamped with a cross. To most eyes, they are mute relics, but if you listen carefully, they begin to speak. You can almost hear the rhythm of chanting voices, the shuffle of processions, the laughter of villagers, the tolling of bells. These are not just objects, but echoes, reverberating across centuries. And in their mystery lies their calm. The more we dwell on them, the more they become steady, repetitive, almost meditative, like the quiet breathing of history itself, rising and falling in a gentle rhythm, lulling us toward stillness. When we think of medieval weddings, it is easy to imagine a single story: brides in fine gowns, church bells ringing, noble feasts stretching late into the night. Yet the reality was far more complex. Just as society itself was layered, from peasants who labored in fields to nobles who dined in great halls, so too were the weddings, which reflected both the wealth and the worries of each social stratum. Let us begin by returning to the world of the peasants. Their weddings were often practical affairs, arranged around the agricultural calendar. Harvest finished, winter stores secured. Only then could a family afford the food, drink, and time needed to host a celebration. In villages, weddings were less about spectacle and more about survival. A union meant two pairs of hands to till the land, two networks of kin to share resources, two families bound together against the hardships of famine and taxation. The rituals were shaped by necessity: feasts with bread, ale, and pottage, gifts not of jewels, but of livestock or tools, dances that unfolded in the open air rather than in decorated halls. Contrast this with the nobility. For the elite, weddings were staged performances of status and authority. Nobles sought to dazzle not only their guests, but their rivals, weaving messages of wealth and power into every detail. Gowns were stitched from imported silks, dyed in colors that spoke of prestige. Musicians were summoned, tables groaned under exotic foods, citrus fruits, almonds, spiced wine brought from distant ports. Guests could expect tournaments or pageants to accompany the vows, spectacles designed to transform a union into a public theater of grandeur. And yet, beneath the glitter of noble weddings lay anxieties not unlike those of common folk. The noblewoman might wear brocade, but she too feared childbearing, the uncertainty of alliance, the weight of expectations. The nobleman might smile as he raised a golden goblet, but in his mind swirled calculations of inheritance, dowry, and loyalty. Weddings at every level were less about romance than about survival, whether survival of households or of dynasties. One striking social difference appears in the nature of dowries. For peasants, a dowry might consist of a cow, a small plot of land, or a chest of linens. For nobles, it could involve entire provinces. A single marriage contract might shift borders, grant castles, or secure vassals. The contrast is staggering, yet the underlying principle is the same. Marriage redistributed wealth and responsibility, weaving families into larger networks of obligation. Another contrast lies in the spaces of celebration. Peasants held their feasts in barns, village greens, or simple halls. Nobles staged theirs in great chambers with vaulted ceilings, walls hung with embroidered banners, floors scattered with rushes perfumed with herbs. The sounds, too, diverged. The rough laughter of villagers dancing to fiddles versus the measured steps of nobles moving to lutes and shawms. And yet, in both, the heartbeat of celebration was identical. Music, movement, and communal joy. Perhaps the most telling difference emerges in the visibility of ritual. In villages, weddings were embedded in community. The entire parish attended. Blessings were shouted across fields. Neighbors carried gifts of bread and ale. Among the elite, the audience shifted outward. Ambassadors, rival lords, chroniclers. Here, weddings became spectacles meant to be recorded, remembered, and envied. But there's also an unexpected similarity, the need to guard against misfortune. Whether peasant or noble, all feared the evil eye, envy, and ill omen. Both tucked charms into garments. Both lit candles at thresholds. Both marked thresholds with prayers or herbs. A noble might hire a cleric to compose protective prayers, while a peasant might scatter salt. But the impulse was the same, to shield a fragile new beginning from the unseen dangers of the world. To imagine these contrasts is to see medieval society in motion. Picture a single day in summer. In one corner of the countryside, a peasant couple shares bread beneath an oak tree as neighbors clap in rhythm. At the same time, in a distant castle, a noble bride walks beneath tapestries, jewels glittering, her every step watched by envoys. Different in scale, in tone, in luxury, but alike in the essential rhythm of vows, blessings, and the weaving of two lives into one. The medieval world was never uniform. Its weddings show us that love, duty, fear, and hope were not distributed evenly, but they were shared universally. Beneath the gold thread and the homespun linen, human longing remained the same. The contrast between noble and peasant weddings becomes even more vivid when we step deeper into the rituals themselves. Some customs, practiced across social levels, took on strikingly different appearances depending on wealth and rank. To understand these differences is to glimpse the social fabric of medieval Europe, where every detail was charged with meaning. Let us begin with the procession. Among peasants, the procession to the church or village green was a noisy and communal affair. Neighbors joined in, some carrying torches or branches decorated with ribbons, others simply walking alongside, eager to witness the vows. The bride's path might be scattered with herbs to ward off evil, or lined with children laughing as they tried to snatch leftover treats. For nobles, the procession transformed into a display of hierarchy. Horses draped in embroidered cloth carried knights in shining armor. Pages held banners, and trumpeters announced the approach of the bridal party. The bride might arrive under a canopy, her gown heavy with gold thread. The very act of moving from one space to another was choreographed as theater, reinforcing the dignity of the families involved. Consider also the vows themselves. For peasants, vows were often spoken in the local tongue, simple and direct. The priest might bless the union with a few prayers, sometimes even in the open air if the church could not accommodate all who wished to attend. For nobles, the vows were layered with Latin liturgy, sometimes accompanied by lengthy negotiations over dowry terms or land agreements read aloud before witnesses. What was for villagers a solemn promise could for lords be a binding treaty. The feasts, too, reveal a social spectrum. Peasant fare consisted of rye bread, cheese, ale, and hearty stews, punctuated perhaps by a roasted goose if the family could afford it. Nobles dined on courses that arrived in stages, each announced with ceremony. Venison, swan, pies shaped into castles, and spiced wine poured into goblets of silver. Yet, whether rich or poor, both groups found joy in music, in dancing, and in the shared release of laughter. One curious ritual that transcended class lines was the bedding ceremony. This was the moment when the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber, often with guests in attendance to ensure propriety. For peasants, this might mean a handful of relatives following the couple into a cottage, offering blessings before withdrawing. For nobles, the ceremony became highly formalized. The couple was led to a chamber hung with fine tapestries, the bed itself displayed with pride. Witnesses, sometimes even dignitaries, remained to see the newlyweds tucked beneath covers before retiring. It was a ritual both practical and symbolic, ensuring that the union was legitimate and that heirs could be expected. Clothing also marked difference. A peasant bride might wear her best dress, borrowed or newly made, adorned with simple flowers or ribbons. A noble bride's attire could weigh many pounds, layered with silks, ermine, and embroidered hems. Jewelry glittered, rings, brooches, belts, each carrying meaning. A girdle clasped at the waist might symbolize chastity, while a ring sealed with a family crest tied her identity to her new household. Yet in both cases, garments were treasured, remembered, and sometimes handed down through generations. Even gifts reflected the spectrum. Villagers brought eggs, flour, or a small sum of coin. Nobles exchanged lands, jewels, and relics. But the intention was constant: to strengthen ties, to show support, to mark the beginning of shared responsibility. One more shared thread runs through all weddings, noble or humble: the mingling of solemnity with festivity. Weddings were religious rites, binding unions before God. But they were also moments of relief in a life marked by toil or tension. Music, dance, and feasting lifted spirits across the spectrum. A noble feast might resound with courtly dances, while a village green erupted with round dances and stamping feet. The joy was the same, though the settings differed. And beneath these differences lies a universal truth. Weddings, whether clothed in silk or homespun wool, were moments of transition. They marked the passage from childhood to adulthood, from one household to another, from uncertainty to shared responsibility. The rituals varied in grandeur, but their purpose was shared across the social spectrum: to bind people together, to create stability, and to declare before community and God the new life had begun. If you imagine the two scenes side by side, the peasant feast and the noble banquet, you may notice not only contrasts, but reflections. Bread and wine appear in both, though one coarse, the other refined. Laughter fills both halls, though one humble, the other vast. In these echoes we find the heart of medieval society, separate worlds, yet bound by shared rhythms. As our journey through the world of medieval weddings draws towards close, it is worth pausing to reflect on the way these rituals illuminated not only love and alliance, but the very structure of medieval society. Weddings were never simply personal affairs. They were statements of belonging, acts of continuity, and sometimes subtle contests of power. The divide between rich and poor, noble and peasant, echoed in every detail. but so too did the shared humanity that transcended those lines. Among the peasantry, weddings stitched together fragile communities. In times when famine, plague, or heavy taxation threatened survival, marriage offered a fragile form of stability. Families pooled resources, neighbors stood as witnesses, and the parish church provided sacred sanction. These small unions, while modest, were vital to the continuity of village life. The rituals, bread broken, ale shared, blessings whispered, were humble but deeply meaningful. For nobles, weddings resonated far beyond family. A single union could shift the fate of kingdoms, change the balance of power, or spark conflict. Chronicles record elaborate ceremonies that lasted days, even weeks, attended by ambassadors and rival lords. A noble wedding was less about two people than about dynasties, alliances, and the theater of authority. The rituals themselves were the same in essence as those of peasants. Vows, blessings, feasting, but magnified, amplified, and imbued with a heavy weight of consequence. Yet both peasants and nobles sought protection against uncertainty. Superstitions flowed freely through all layers of society. Some families sprinkled wheat across thresholds to encourage fertility. Others whispered charms against barrenness. Noble brides might carry relics of saints, sewn secretly into their gowns. Peasant brides might wear garlands of herbs, thought to repel misfortune. In both, the desire was the same: to shield the fragile union from invisible forces of envy, illness, or ill luck. Even entertainment reflected contrasts and similarities. Peasants gathered around fiddlers, stamping feet on packed earth, circling in dances that drew everyone into the rhythm. Nobles entertained their guests with minstrels, jesters, or even stage tournaments, where knights paraded in their finest armor. Yet in both, the pulse of music, the sound of laughter, and the sight of faces lit by firelight created an atmosphere of collective joy. One striking example of difference lies in how communities recorded weddings. Among peasants, memory was oral, stories told by elders, fragments of song recalling a particular celebration, perhaps an entry in a parish register. For nobles, weddings were documented in chronicles, immortalized in manuscripts, even depicted in illuminated panels. The noble union was meant to be remembered, a legacy of ink and parchment, while the peasant union lived primarily in living memory. And yet, for both, the significance was no less real, the forging of bonds that shaped lives and futures. As we consider these contrasts, it is helpful to imagine the medieval world as a tapestry. Some threads are coarse, woven from wool, dyed in earthy browns and greens. Others gleam in silk and gold, and yet all are woven together, forming a single picture. Weddings are among the clearest scenes in that tapestry. Peasants and nobles alike marking the threshold between past and future, private and public, duty and hope. The echoes of these rituals still linger. Many modern customs, the wearing of rings, the blessing of unions in sacred spaces, the gathering of family and friends, trace their roots back to these medieval practices. We no longer escort couples to their beds with entire households watching, nor do we trade castles as dowries. But the impulse remains: to make vows in the presence of others, to share joy through feasting, to mark the mystery of two lives joining as one. In these echoes, we find continuity, and in the contrasts, we glimpse a society deeply divided by wealth and rank, yet unified by common rhythms of birth, marriage, and death. Weddings reveal not only how people celebrated, but also how they understood themselves and their place in the world. And so, as we step back from the flickering candlelight of medieval halls, whether humble cottages or gilded chambers, we can let the voices of the past grow quiet. The laughter fades, the music drifts into silence, and the vows spoken centuries ago remain as whispers in history. What remains for us is the calm realization that across all times and places, love, duty, and hope are threads that never truly vanish. And now, dear listener, our slow walk through the strange and fascinating rituals of medieval weddings comes to an end. We have wandered through cottages and castles, stood in village greens and great halls, and listened to the echoes of vows spoken in both humble voices and in solemn Latin. We have seen how peasants and nobles, though divided by wealth and power, shared in the same longing to bind lives together, to mark the mystery of union, and to protect fragile futures with blessings, charms, and community. What stands out most, perhaps, is how weddings in the Middle Ages were less about romance and more about structure. They were events that tied households, secured alliances, and gave rhythm to the life of villages and kingdoms. Yet beneath those layers of duty and formality, we glimpse the familiar: music and laughter, food and dancing, the hope that tomorrow might be kinder when faced together. As the centuries pass, the details change. Dowries shrink from castles to coins, processions shift from torchlight to motor cars, and feasts from pottage to wedding cakes. But the heartbeat remains. Across all ages, people have sought to make promises before their communities, to celebrate with joy, and to carry the hope of shared futures. In that way, the medieval world is not so far from our own. So as you rest now, you might imagine those distant voices fading into silence. The flicker of torchlight in a courtyard grows dim. The last note of music drifts away. The heavy doors of a stone church close with a gentle thud. The guests disperse into the night, some along dirt paths, others through castle gates. The candles burn low, the feasts are finished, and all that remains is the hush of history. And here you are, safe in your own time, in your own quiet space. No feast to prepare, no dowries to negotiate, no villagers clamoring for ale. Only stillness, only calm. You are far from the weight of medieval duty, and yet you carry with you the quiet comfort of knowing that people, long ago, also sought connection, companionship, and peace. If this kind of calm, soft storytelling helps you drift toward rest, I invite you, gently, to like this video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you wish, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It is strangely comforting to know that others, scattered across the world, are falling asleep to the same gentle rhythms of boring history. Together, we make a quiet community, woven not by duty, but by stillness and rest. So close your eyes now. Let the stories of medieval weddings fade into dreams. Let sleep take its place where history leaves off. You are safe, you are calm, and the past has done its work. Good night.